When another man dared to invite her, something ancient stirred in him. It was not rage alone, but a vow forged by storms, loyalty, and years of silent watching. In a town that remembered everything, boundaries mattered and lines were not crossed. What followed was not violence, but a reckoning no one expected. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell for more powerful stories of love, loyalty, and consequence. He was 50, a quay master called keeper by a town that liked its responsibilities stated plainly, as a list might be, a man who kept moorings taut and records tighter still. He had the look of someone who had learned to fold himself around duty, broad shoulders that hunched when someone asked for favors, hands that read knots the way others read books, and a face ridged by years of wind and salt. He smelled of old rope, sea salt, and the faint iron tang of ledger ink. The town of Agada hunched along the coast like an old dog, alert and quietly pleased to be useful. The pier stepped into the water like a careful finger, gulls kept score of days, and fishermen mended nets in doorways where the air tasted of diesel and rosemary. The museum sat at the edge of the lane, a low building with windows that forgot to be clean and a back room where tiles, boat parts, and oddities waited like stories mid-sentence. Mara arrived in autumn with a battered satchel and a roll of sketches bound in twine, her hair pulled into a knot that batted the sun back politely, and hands that had learned to coax pigments and varnish into behaving. She was 32, a conservator who had spent years in cities with museums that spoke correct English and had climate controls that worried like watchful nannies. She had come home after those years, partly because of the sea and partly because home had a way of asking for things you could not refuse. She wore paint-stained jeans, a cardigan that smelled faintly of lavender, and a stubborn gentleness that left people wondering how such softness readied itself to be reliable. They met because a storm had disgorged a fragment of a mosaic onto the shingle, a cerulean tile edged in gold, the scale of a fin, and the museum director thought of a summer rush and postcards and made the sensible decision to find someone who could make the tile whole again. Raphael had keys to every locked place in the port and a willingness to do favors as a way of being necessary. The first time he saw Mara, he thought she was small enough to be interesting and strong enough to be useful, and he said, calmly, "We can make a schedule," and she smiled and unrolled brushes like tools for a surgeon and answered with the names of adhesives he would never have guessed existed. At first, they spoke in the language of work. He would obtain permits and supervise the unloading of crates. She would dust, consolidate, and reattach fragments in the light room where silence behaved like a religious law. Their conversations were efficient and a little shy. What grit to stop at, which solvent would not eat through a glaze, where to place a lettered crate so the humidity would be least dangerous. Then small exchanges arrived like shells on a shore. He began to leave practical gifts, a warm loaf wrapped in oilcloth, a twine of dried herbs. For the paint room, she left him diagrams in purple ink of his ledger that made his entries look less like the handwriting of a sentinel and more like someone's sketch of expectation. Town rumor was slow but vigorous. They whispered about the keeper who was softer, about the conservator who had polished edges that were not meant to be polished. Raphael pretended not to care, and failed elegantly, because he found himself timing his rounds to cross hers, listening for the click of her tools like a man who waits for a favorite clock to chime. Mara discovered he had a tenderness for small things. He could tie a sailor's knot with one hand while balancing a tray with the other. He kept lists in pencil inside his ledger that no one ever saw, and sometimes, when she walked past the storeroom, he would lay aside the log and lean his head against the door as if to hear what the building might say. The rival arrived as if belonging in a different kind of weather. Joachim ran a cafe behind the fish stalls, a narrow room that smelled of coffee and lemon peel, and where fishermen played cards and exchanged weather predictions like currency. He had been a boy who loved bread, which made him now into a man who baked as if confession could rise in the oven. He had known Mara in childhood and claimed the sort of calm affection that comes from being present rather than dramatic. He asked her to dinner with the simple economy of someone who had learned to trust small pleasures. Mara said yes because she liked being pleased and because Joachim's kitchen saved her from thinking of work for an evening. Raphael did not storm the cafe. He tightened his jaw and rearranged his schedule, finding reasons to be on the pier when the sun fell. He left notes that were neat and exact and began appearing in the museum with practical excuses. Their margin notes grew into a private grammar, which brushes to keep, how to label a tray, the correct pressure for a cloth when blotting varnish. People noticed and smiled in the way small towns do when a stitch begins in the fabric of a life. Joachim brewed excellent coffee and watched from the doorway, hands flour dusted and steady, and he liked the idea of a life warmed by someone whose laughter made the cafe feel like a house. The night the generator failed, the museum held so much history that it sounded like a living thing. Mara was cataloguing fragments by color under a lantern when the world went black. The air in the museum tightened into the smell of linseed and old paper and the faintly metallic breath of a building that had seen more storms than the town remembered. Raphael, who had been checking moorings, found the museum doors stuck and knocked until she opened. She stood framed in amber, hair salt-streaked and eyes bright enough to see in the dark. They fit into the doorway like halves of a story that had not yet learned its ending. Inside, the sea made a new music, distant and insistent. Raphael closed his eyes against a memory that had not softened with time. When a storm had taken his brother and sound had become something that stayed lodged inside him. Like barnacles, he leaned his back against a wooden door and felt his ribs shrink. Mara saw the change in him as clearly as she would have seen solvent on a brush, and without dramatics she stepped close and laid her hand over his sternum to feel the quick, unfair rhythm there. "Breathe with me," she said, counting slow numbers as if counting tide marks. He breathed with her, 4 in and out, until the panic thinned to an ache the way wind loves to leave small holes in a sweater. When the lights returned, they sat together under the humming fluorescence and did not move. Immediately, as if conserving the shape of what had just become possible. Their closeness was not earnest plot building. It arrived in careful increments, a shared thermos of tea on a morning with fog that made the sea look like marble, an argument about the best way to remove a stubborn stain. A hand reached across a table to brush a speck of dust off someone else's sleeve and remaining there a moment too long to claim nothing. They learned the names of each other's rituals. Raphael learned Mara's preference for a clean brush before dinner. Mara learned Raphael's habit of checking the tide tables at midnight. Those rituals became the steady architecture of something that neither of them had a map for, but both were willing to inhabit. Joachim, not a villain, but a man who wanted softly, kept bringing small kindnesses. He left a cup of coffee at the museum door sometimes, and once he left a small pot of basil on the windowsill. He would speak to Mara about simple things. Whether to lay a tablecloth inside the cafe, which spices make fish sing on the tongue, the line between being romantic and being practical. He liked her because she was kind and because kindness was a rare currency in places that survived by being stern. He did not plot or scheme, he simply offered a life that smelled like bread and did not ask for storms as proofs of loyalty. Raphael felt jealousy like a low fever. He did not shout. He did not stage a melodrama in the market square. He did what he knew. He turned inward and tried to be better at being necessary. He left practical notes that were considerate rather than invasive. He started bringing the museum small repairs he had done himself, replacing a cracked handle, oiling a hinge, leaving his marks on things that would not require explanation. Mara read his marginalia and often left a scrap of varnish dusted cloth in return. She liked both men and did not want to choose mistakenly. To be honest with herself meant to be honest about her fear of being the cause of a rift and her desire to be both loved and undisturbed by heroics. Then something happened that rearranged the harbor's grammar. An anonymous blog called The Needle began publishing essays about lost rescues and choices that men with ledger hands had made. The posts were literate and sharp and included references to a storm years ago when a rescue had gone wrong and a rumor that some captains had chosen cargo over crew in the chaos. The piece was a sliver of accusation and the town's gossip found a new diet in it. People who had trusted Raphael asked questions. He found a photocopy of the essay folded on a bench and felt the old thing in his chest wake up, that sense of being small against the sea's long appetite. Raphael wanted facts. He wanted manifests and radio transcripts and to point to times printed in ink and say, "Look, I did this." But he also knew that facts rarely comfort grief and that the people who had lost something wanted more than receipts. Mara read The Needle and felt a tug toward context. She began to comb through logs and to talk to fishermen and the families, to stitch names to dates, to hold people's stories as a conservator holds fragile pigment, gently, precisely. People began to come to the museum with packets and cassette tapes, with weather logs and photographs, like offerings left at an altar of memory. The town gathered, as towns do. A council meeting turned into a small theater where accusations might be made and where someone might be pronounced guilty by a crowd that wanted a shape for sorrow. Instead, Mara stood up. She laid a parcel on the mayor's table and said, with an unflappable calm, "The Needle asks hard questions. We must answer not with 50 more accusations but with listening." She proposed a public forum, not a trial, a place where memories could be spoken and heard. It was an audacious kindness. Raphael sat with his jaw tight and his palms pressed together as if willing himself to be patient. Joachim watched with the quiet hope of a man who had learned to measure his desire in cups of coffee rather than in grand gestures. The forum was a crooked kind of miracle. People came with envelopes, with audio tapes and old telegrams. They told stories that were small and ordinary and so enormous in their quiet. A jacket lost in a swell and later found washed ashore with a note inside. A son who had returned holding a small carved fish that had belonged to a man he did not remember. A radio recording of Maydays that sounded like someone choking. There was anger and there was tenderness. The anonymous blog did not vanish. Instead, the town began to read it as part of the conversation, and not as the only voice. For some people this was forgiveness. For others it was documentation. The Needle wrote back with a softer edge, asking for more testimony and less thunder. The surprising twist came out of the smallness of things rather than the melodrama of villainy. Joachim, who had been steady as dough in his hands, stood in the market at dusk and confessed to a friend that years earlier he had written a letter in anger about the old rescue and had left it in the cafe as a note rather than making it public. He had never intended to be scoria or to publish under the name. His anger had been private and clumsy, meant for ears, not a platform. Someone else had used his words and given them a sharp edge, and the blog had grown from that seed. When this trace was investigated, a handle pointed to several local IPs and confessions that did not amount to an unveiling but to a messy, human truth. Anger in a small town spreads the way spilled coffee does, staining everyone in reach. Joachim did not stand at the forum to confess publicly. Instead, he offered, quietly, to bake for the follow-up meetings and to host listening hours in his cafe. The town accepted, not because they believed him less, but because most people prefer to hold a garden to growing crops of vengeance. That twist, small and human, allowed Mara to see both men with new clarity. Joachim was honest in his remorse and steady in his offerings. Raphael was earnest and keen to repair not only logs but the social fabric. Mara did not make an immediate nightly choice. She loved coffee mornings and dough and the rhythm of Joachim's kindness. She loved Raphael's hands, the way he handled boat lines as if reading the thoughts of ropes, the way he had once pressed his palm to a ribbon on a memorial and seemed surprised that his own fingers had begun to soften. She loved different things about each man and feared choosing wrongly, because the town took things personally and because her own heart had been slow to decide. The months that followed were an architecture of smallness. Mara took both men to the boatyard to teach them to handle delicate fragments that would shatter if mistreated. They learned each other's touch. Raphael's strength was careful. Joachim's gentleness was patient. There were nights Mara slept with one and afternoons with the other, not as a secret drama but as an experiment in honesty. She told them both plainly that she did not want deception to be a foundation for any relationship. It was a risky honesty that demanded courage from all three. The town noticed and argued, and some gossip hardened like old stucco, but many people admired the bravery of people attempting to be humane instead of theatrical. Physical intimacy threaded the narrative with little explosions of tenderness rather than the sort of cinematic fever that novels sometimes require. Raphael kissed Mara's wrist in the kitchen when she stirred a pot of stew, his lips lingering as if to memorize the map of her skin. He held her face between his hands in a corridor while a rainstorm pressed the windows as if eavesdropping, and their foreheads met in a silent agreement to be kind to each other's pasts. Joachim, meanwhile, learned to plant small kisses on her temple while she read notes in his cafe, catching a laugh like a net. There was a shared bed on a winter night where all three found themselves in the same small apartment in the days of the exhibit and slept in a line like children who had finally confessed their fear of sleeping alone. None of it was obscene. It was intimacy of guardianship and consent, of hands mapping and teaching and lingering in places where scars were thin and maps could be redrawn. Mara's desire did not collapse into a simple triangle of demand. She wanted to be loved and to be safe. She wanted to be kept and to have her autonomy honored. She started sleeping sometimes in Raphael's small room above the old quay office where the sea sounded like a slow train, and other nights she stayed in the cafe's back quarters with Joachim where the oven hummed and the smell of rising dough made everything feel possible. They made clear agreements about nights and confidences like sailors setting watches. When jealousy rose, it was met with conversation at dawn, the sort that breaks open old habits and leaves soft, workable planks in their place. The exhibit on rescue and memory became a turning point. The restored mosaic was mounted, and panels told stories about small acts of heroism and choices that had left difficult residues. People came from towns nearby to see an exhibition where the curator refused to make villains or saints and instead held grief alongside bravery. The Needle published a piece about the exhibit that read like a mercy rather than an indictment. During the opening night, when the sea made a sound like distant applause, Joachim surprised Mara with a small cake and a single candle, and Raphael pressed a strip of old rope into the artistically arranged display as a quiet joke about the things they all repaired together. The confusion never vanished completely, and neither did the tenderness. There were fights that left bruises on the hearts rather than the skin. Arguments about which tiles to include, about how much of a past rescue to expose in a label, whether a memorial plaque might reopen old wounds. Each fight required coffee the next morning and the ritual of apologizing with physical gestures as well as words. Raphael would kiss the inside of Mara's wrist and offer a steady hand to climb down from a boat. Joachim would sit with her on an iron crate and trace small patterns in the dust until she could laugh again. These acts were not merely reparative, they were the language the three of them invented to communicate when words fell short. Then came the night of reckoning and choice. A letter arrived addressed to the museum with no return, and inside it was a single sheet of handwriting that suggested a meeting at the bay at dawn. The note was simple: "We need to talk." It could have been scoria or a curious local wanting to mend fences. Mara hesitated but agreed to go with both men, saying she did not want to be alone with accusation. They met on the stones before the sun had a chance to color the shell of the sky. The meeting tasted of salt and the possibility of confession. A figure approached from the curve of the harbor, a woman with a scarf that had been knitted by hands that knew how to hold a ship and a face that carried the quiet evidence of having listened to too much. She said she had written under the name Scoria for a long time but never meant to make one person a scapegoat. She had been the neighbor who once watched a rescue go wrong and had carried that night in her like a shard. She admitted to using the blog as a way to make people notice because notice was the only currency that made her feel less alone. But the final twist was the small, human admission that made everything more honest. She confessed she had once shown the draft of a vitriolic paragraph to Joachim, who had offered no editorial advice and had been part of a chain of casual speech it had been assumed would stay private. Joachim, surprised and ashamed, admitted he had written a private letter in anger years ago but had not published it. He had not been Scoria. The town had been feeding itself on a story that had tangled like nets. The confession revealed more about how communities wound themselves together than about single acts of betrayal. After the dawn conversation, the three of them walked back to the pier under a sky that had decided to clear, and the terrain between them had shifted into a garden that would need tending. Mara sat on a low stone and looked at both men. She thought of the way Raphael had steadied her in the museum and how his hands seemed to know the direction of a rope before she did. She thought of Joachim's hands, flower-dusted and ready to share the ease of his life. She had loved both in different ways, and the truth she finally admitted was not dramatic but quiet. I want partnership that includes care, honesty, and a life that does not force me to choose between kindness and being known. In the end, Mara chose to build a life primarily with Raphael. The decision was not an erasure of the tenderness with Joachim, but a selection of the shape she wanted most nights to come. She chose Raphael because, through the months, he had learned to hold grief not as evidence of weakness but as something to be shared and stewarded, because his carefulness matched the soft places inside her that needed gentleness, and because with him she felt she could make a home on a shore that would sometimes be cruel. Joachim did not collapse into wounded silence. He stayed in town, his cafe remained a haven for listening hours, and he became a crucial partner in the museum's outreach, often lending his space for meetings and hosting workshops on memory and craft. He remained a friend and an intimate, in a way that honored the honesty they had all promised one another. Their romantic life with Raphael unfolded as a slow, tactile practice. They learned to sleep together in ways that respected both the urgency of desire and the need for patience. They kissed like people learning to remember how to take care, fingertip kisses along the wrist, mouths resting long on quiet places like the hollow of a collarbone, shared showers where water loosened old age in the bones, and nights of holding that required no more than the warmth of another body against one's own. They made love that was careful and expansive at once, hands that learned the geography of scars, breath matching breath, stops and starts to check for consent and to savor. It was not a single blaze but a series of candles lit over months, each flame careful, each extinguished with the same tenderness with which it had been ignited. Mara and Raphael also deeply shared a friendship with Joachim, who came to openings and mended nets and sat at their kitchen table when they could not sleep. There were moments of intimacy that included Joachim in gentle ways, a forehead touch when he arrived with a loaf, a brief hand squeeze during an emotional speech, the three of them sleeping in the same small apartment after a long night of installation, warm and tangled but respectful in the morning. The arrangement was not a circus. It required continued consent and heavy conversation and, sometimes, recalibration when jealousy bubbled up. They practiced forgiveness like a craft, careful, practiced, and applied with patience. The town healed in incremental ways. The exhibit remained but changed tone, the needle continued but with less venom, and the forum became a tradition where each year, people gathered to share small archives and to teach younger fishermen the names of old ropes and the prayers people recited before launching. The museum placed the restored mosaic with a small ribbon that read "Keep Breathing," and on the anniversary Raphael and Mara and Joachim would stand at the edge of the pier and speak of the year gone by and the years to come. Years later, people would tell a version of this story in laugh soft tones. They would say the keeper married the conservator and the cafe kept baking bread for anniversaries. They would not always name Joachim correctly in later tellings, and sometimes the tenderness of the truth would be left out for the sake of a cleaner plot. But those who had been there would remember the nights they had held each other against the sound of a sea that never stopped trying to test them. They would remember that the best promises were small ones repeated: check the ropes, warm the bread, kiss the wrist, and listen. If you go to a Garda and stand by the museum, you might find a small box of ceramic chips tied with twine and a note that reads "Keep breathing." If you look carefully, you will find 3 names carved into the underside of the bench where the fishermen nap: Raphael, Mara, and Joachim, all of them written in different hands and all of them true in their own imperfect ways. Because the last lesson the town offered was simple and stubborn: love can be many-handed, grief can be shared, and honesty, sometimes messy and slow, is the only thing that repairs a broken harbor. Time kept its own slow ledger after that, inscribing small rituals into the days so that the extraordinary grew comfortable in the margins. Mara and Raphael settled into a cadence that resembled a harbor tide, predictable, occasionally violent, and always returning to a certain Sure, they learned, with a steadiness that softened them, to catalogue not only artifacts but the quiet cartography of each other, which sentences set the other to laughter, what weather on the calendar meant worry, which songs calmed a night that might have otherwise stretched thin and sharp. The museum became an argument and a shelter at the same time. The new exhibits that Mara curated after the rescue forum were patient affairs, panels layered with small testimonies and objects that smelled faintly of someone else's hands. Children from the school came in with backpacks and attentive faces and asked the kinds of blunt, wild questions only the very young can ask. They wanted to know whether the sea ever forgave itself, whether ropes could be repaired after they had broken, whether a man who had been brave could still be afraid afterward. Raphael taught the children how to tie a bowline with one hand, how to braid a length of spare line so that it could be used to mend a net, and how to respect the life of an object. He told them stories that were short and practical and always left room at the end for a question. In the kitchen behind the museum, Joachim made sandwiches and poured tea for volunteers. He taught a young apprentice named Anna how to knead in a way that taught patience rather than speed, how to count breaths between folds of dough. Anna was small and quick and had a way of looking as if she was trying to read the seams of the world. She had come from inland, where the land felt like a map and the sea like a rumor. She arrived at Joachim's cafe one morning with a rolled sleeve and the blunt humility of someone who wanted work more than affection. Joachim hired her because he liked the way her face softened when she folded a pastry and because he needed another pair of hands willing to stay when the oven was stubborn. The three of them, Raphael, Mara, and Joachim, took to mentoring Anna in the afternoon quiet after the cafe closed and the museum's evening lights warmed the windows. They taught her how to hold a ceramic shard without bruising the glaze, how to read a ledger like it contained the ghost of a life, and how a loaf could be proof of daily care. Anna learned other things too. That grief could be a shape to place on a shelf rather than a wound you were obliged to display every day, that apologies mattered when accompanied by small deeds, and that people who loved each other might also disappoint each other. One spring brought a stubborn plan from the municipal council to enlarge the port. A development team with neat brochures arrived, with renderings of gleaming dockside promenades and a promise of visitors. They spoke of improved moorings and an economic future that trembled with spreadsheet optimism. To some in Argada, the plan promised prosperity. To others it looked like the slow erasure of memory. The developers proposed to tear down a row of old sheds where children had once hidden and where the pier still smelled of coal and old varnish. Mara walked the proposed line of destruction with Raphael beside her and felt a pressure in her chest that had nothing to do with the wind. She imagined the museum losing its back room, the place where fragments slept and where fishermen left cups of tea on rainy days. Joachim, who had the town's ear because of his oven and soft ways, gathered signatures with his apron dusted in flour and a quiet argument that tasted of common sense. The town split in the clean way old places do, those hungry for change and those who remembered. They organized a petition and a small exhibition that demonstrated what would be lost. Mara curated panels of photos and testimonies showing where boats had once tied and which children had learned to read the sea from a father at the stern. Raphael took to standing in the council chamber during hearings, palms folded as if in prayer and ledger open to a list of names. Anna, new to civic struggle, sat for hours in the front row with a thermos and a patience that made old fishermen nod as if seeing their own grandchildren. Arguments were held in the cafe and in the churchyard and on the pier itself. There were compromises and shouts and days in which it felt as if the town's skin had been rubbed raw. In the end, the council approved a revised plan that kept the museum's back rooms and preserved a strip of the old sheds as a memory lane while allowing improvements elsewhere. The victory was partial and tasted like a thin bread, but it was theirs, a proof that places with histories do not always have to be swallowed whole for the sake of imagined glories. During those nights of agitation, Raphael found himself returning to certain pieces of old rope that had been given to the museum by a captain who had sailed once to the other side of the world and back. He would sit with fragments spread like a map and trace a history with his fingertip. He thought often of his brother, and of the way the sea takes and gives without consulting the ledger of a man. One evening, long after the council had adjourned and the cafe had emptied, Anna found him at the pier, a coil of rope on his lap and the moon like a coin in the water. He told her bits of his story in the way men tell stories to children, shaved of certain sharpness and made safe for company. He admitted, without seeking mercy, that there were nights he still woke with the impression that sound had landed inside him and would not leave. He described how he had learned to name the moment when he needed to anchor himself to someone else, how he had learned to accept help the way one accepts sin offered hand to climb back into a skiff. Anna listened, and in the listening she found a template for her own life. She practiced tying knots under the lamplight and understood that some kinds of steadiness are taught by a look and others by touch. She wanted more than the apprenticeship in the cafe. She wanted to know what it meant to make a life where objects and people were tended with the same kind of attention. Raphael told her, simply, if you want to keep things, learn to love what will eventually break. The town had its rituals. There was a midsummer night when everyone came down to the pier with lanterns and old songs. The museum opened late and displayed a collection of postcards from sailors who had once called Agada a waypoint. Joachim baked a ring of bread that would be cut into pieces which each family took home. The three of them stood side by side, Raphael with a shawl knitted by a neighbor, Mara in a coat smeared faintly with soil from the conservation room, Joachim with flour on his sleeves, and felt, as if for a brief instant, that the world had arranged itself into something peaceful. Change, however, rarely kept to the edges of small satisfactions. A summer storm arrived with a suddenness that is common where weather has teeth. The sky blackened in an hour and the sea, which had been a companion, turned into a force that wanted to rewrite the shore. Boats banged against moorings, and a barge from a neighboring town lost its lines and made for the rocks. The rescue teams called, the town mobilized, and Raphael found himself with the old twitching responsibility he had never quite shed. The rescue was difficult. The barge's crew were tired and frightened, and the ocean wanted them for itself. Raphael and a crew of volunteers worked by muscle memory and experience and something that felt like faith. They threw lines and shouted instructions, and at one point the rope screamed as it took a load it had not been expecting. A young man on the barge slipped and the world narrowed to the sound of water and a rope and Raphael's hands, which somehow found grip where there had been none before. After the immediate danger passed and bodies were counted and the barge nearly freed, the town kept a long silence as if trying to decide how loud relief should be. That night, Raphael stood on the pier, soaked through and exhausted, and Mara found him leaning on the railing, his face blank with the memory of the old storm. She folded a blanket around his shoulders, her fingers steady as if she had been sewing the edge of his life back together. They did not speak much, There was no need. In the morning the newspaper ran a small headline and the cafe prepared extra bread for the crew. The storm left marks beyond the physical. It pulled up things that the water had been hiding: an old crate, a faded journal, a carved figure that had been tossed loose from some ship long ago. The museum received these things like offers and Mara catalogued them, hands moving with expert motions. She had practiced for years. She discovered a note tucked inside the journal, written in a hand that had learned to stamp letters with salt and hurry. The note addressed, curious and direct. Read. If you find this, leave it where the light finds it. They pinned the note beside the carved figure and an odd procession of townspeople came in to see the small discovery. Someone believed the figure was a token from a child's toy lost in a shipwreck. Another suspected it had been a religious charm. The interpretations multiplied because, as Mara joked, people prefer to invent narratives rather than live with uncertainty. The museum became a place where questions were allowed to stack without the demand of tidy answers. As the years passed, the trio evolved in ways that felt natural rather than dramatic. Joachim's cafe expanded, not into something grand but into an adjacent room where Anna could teach bread making to tourists who came in the summer. Joachim sold small booklets about the town's recipes and donated the proceeds to a fund that paid for free entry to the museum for school children. Mara accepted invitations to speak at small conferences about conservation in unlikely places, and sometimes she would travel for a week and return with a new palette of impressions and a small shell tucked into her pocket. Raphael, as the keeper, acquired new responsibilities as larger boats arrived and the logistics of the harbor grew more complicated. He learned to delegate certain tasks and to teach others how to lift responsibly and to record the names of crew in a manner that honored them. He began to write notes to himself to remember small acts of kindness: ring Anna if the oven fails, check the old captain's line, bring an extra thermos for the volunteers on cold mornings. There were illnesses too, small and inevitable. A winter flu went through the town and left a pale fatigue in its wake. Joachim came down with a fever that made the cafe still for a few days and people worried as if he were the town's hearth. Anna stayed up to tend the ovens and Raphael made long runs to the grocer. The sickness passed and the town rejoiced quietly, as if every recovered body were an affirmation of a fragile collective luck. Time, as it does, brought small bittersweets. The museum received a donation from a family who had emigrated decades before, a crate of letters and trinkets that filled whole afternoons with detective work. The exhibit about rescues remained popular but shifted focus to include tools and practices of preservation. A young curator from the city visited and admired Mara's method, and for once she considered whether she might someday leave, just to see more. She always returned though, because the tide had lettered itself into her bones and because there were hands in this town that needed steadiness. Once, in a quiet winter after too many storms, Raphael received a letter from a sister of the brother he had lost, someone who had lived in a town 3 hours away and had only recently discovered the old name in a family album. The sister requested a meeting and asked for the ledger entries that might help her understand the last day. Raphael felt the old fear that attention would wound rather than console, but he agreed to meet. The conversation with the sister was a small exorcism of sorts. They read names aloud, compared times noted in diaries, and shared the sort of silence that allows grief to rearrange itself into a lesser weight. That meeting changed something quiet in Raphael. He found he could speak about the past without feeling the whole sea rushing into his chest. He also recognized that memory is a collaborative act. No ledger could hold the fullness of a life, and no list could replace the warmth of a human who remembered how a laugh sounded. After the sister left, Raphael sat on the pier for a long time and watched a gull pick at something in the shallows. He thought of the ways the town held stories and how sometimes letting them be told was itself an act of care. Years later, when Mara and Raphael prepared for a simple ceremony to mark the museum's 10th year of the post-forum exhibit, Joachim baked a dozen small cakes and Anna hung paper lanterns that blew like relaxed thoughts in the wind. The mayor gave a short speech that tried to be both earnest and wry, and the museum was full of people who had come to pay attention. There was music, quiet and tuned to the sea, and children running along the galleries with sticky fingers and bright shoes. At the end of the ceremony, Raphael stood before the restored mosaic with Mara at his side and Joachim nearby, their backs to the plaster wall and faces toward the open harbor. He thought of all the things that had kept them bound, storms that taught them how loud the world could be, small betrayals that hissed and then cooled, the long work of learning to be gentle. He remembered, too, that love, like preservation, is an act performed day after day with small tools and patient hands. In time, the three names carved under the bench wore down a little at the edges, from rain and from people sitting and leaning and resting their tired weight. They were no longer sharp, but those who cared could still make out the distinctive slant of Raphael's R, the tidy curl of Mara's M, and the steady loop of Joachim's J, the small box of ceramic chips multiplied as visitors left tiny shards as promises, and the note inside was each year exchanged for a new one. Letters written by children or fishermen, by tourists who had found a Garda like a pause in their travel, by those who simply needed to tuck a piece of a story into a place that kept things. When people asked whether their arrangement had been difficult, the three of them would smile and say yes, and then explain how complicated it was to be generous and truthful at the same time. They would tell stories of jealousy cooled by explanation, of nights where toleration gave way to unexpected compassion, of the work it takes to hold more than one person's heart. People sometimes wanted a simpler ending, a tidy marriage or a solitary retirement, but such clean conclusions rarely matched the way life had leaned into them. Late one summer, a child left a note in the box that read, "How do you keep so many hands from breaking?" The note was small and innocent, and the three adults read it under the museum's dimming lights with a kind of reverence. Mara folded her hands into the shape she used when she consolidated fragile pigment. Raphael placed a hand over hers, as if to steady the motion, and Joachim set a cup of chamomile between them. "We are careful," Raphael wrote in a slow hand, and he added, "because we practice." He then suggested they write a reply together that the museum could display. They wrote about knots and patience and the practice of returning. They wrote, too, about the small art of listening, how a person who has been allowed to speak without interruption will often find a way to be less sharp when they are heard. The reply was pinned beside the box, and visitors read it, and sometimes left their own notes in answer. A stranger from a city far away wrote that they had come looking for a place with a history they could trust, and they left a small coin in the box as if to pay rent for a night's worth of consolation. A fisherman came and placed his palm against the display and breathed as if a memory was settling down into a comfortable seat. Decades accumulated, not as a story of triumph over fate, but as a long record of tending. The town continued to test them. New policies, new boats, younger generation that sometimes valued speed over care, but each test was met with the habits they had learned: show up, repair what you can, listen when someone needs to talk, and bake bread when the weather was severe and people needed a warm place to stand. When Raphael finally considered retiring from his formal keeper duties, it was not because he had grown soft, but because he trusted the lines he had taught. He trained a new keeper with the same mixture of firmness and quiet, and then the new keeper took on the ledger with a slightly different hand. Raphael did not disappear. He remained at the pier in a different role, as an elder who sat on the stone steps and told stories to visitors who asked why the town still kept certain rituals. Mara continued her conservation work well into the years when her hair showed more silver than dark. She kept learning, as conservators always do, because objects change and new techniques arrive that make past practices look like the work of a different era. Joachim's hands, meanwhile, acquired the ease of a man who had spent decades making dough rise while listening. Anna grew and opened her own small bakery across the lane, and named a loaf after a knot Raphael had taught her, a gesture that made him grin every time he read the menu. In the end, the town of Agada kept being itself, a fold of land where people learned to be both fiercely protective and generously forgiving. The museum continued to collect things that smelled faintly of other people's days, and the exhibit that had once been a forum on memory became an archive that taught others how to hold stories. When visitors asked about the shape of their lives, Mara, Raphael, and Joachim would often point to a ceramic chip or to a scar on a plank and say that life is made of many small repairs. On a clear morning, years after the first thaw inside Raphael, he and Mara walked the pier with 2 mugs and no talk heavy enough to count as planning. Joachim arrived with a wrapped loaf and a sideways smile, and they sat together on the edge of the quay, fingers warm from the bread. A gull cried and the sea took another breath. The museum bell rang in the distance for a tour, and a child darted past with an exaggerated step as if trying to outrun an idea. They opened the ceramic chip box and added a new shard, a piece of blue with a gold fleck Raphael had found on a walk. They did not bind the box with sermon or promise. They simply tied it with twine and left it in place. The bench still bore their names, softened by time, but legible if you cared to look. Someone passing by might only notice a bench and a thoughtful town. Others would see the handwork, the knotted story that held people together. If you visit Agada now, stand near the museum and listen. You will hear gulls, the scrape of the market, the occasional laughter from the cafe, and the sound of people practicing habit. The harbor will feel like an object that has been mended enough to hold weight, not by miracle but by repeated care. And if you look under the bench, you might trace 3 faded initials and think of how a town, given a chance, will prefer to save what is worthy of being kept. In the end, the lesson was not that love solves everything or that an exhibit can heal an entire community. It was simpler and truer, that repair is a daily act and that the practice of tending is the same whether you are fixing a mosaic tile or a trust. They kept breathing, and they kept returning, and between them, they found a life that, like a well-tended harbor, made room for many vessels to arrive and to leave. Seasons continued their patient work and a new tradition grew from habit and tenderness. Each spring the museum held a small night of recounting where anyone could come and say a louder memory they had never spoken, a way to keep the past aired and not allowed to spoil. People brought simple offerings, a worn hat, a scrap of sail, a pressed flower, or sometimes only a sentence they had been carrying. The event never promised closure. It offered only company and a place to let in. Old weight be shared. One of the most remembered nights was when a retired captain, whose hands were now thin with age, stood and read a letter to a girlfriend he had left years before when the sea called him to ports that had flirted with fortune. The letter unspooled with the same gentleness with which he had once steered a skiff through fog. People cried, some laughed, most listened. Mara placed the letter behind glass with a note that read remembered and not forgotten. And Raphael made sure the line that held the glass was secure. Small reconciliations happened to a woman who had once accused Raphael in a private conversation of negligence came to the museum years later carrying a photograph of a boy she had not mentioned before. She asked questions and found comfort in the careful manner in which Mara and Raphael treated the past. There was no grand apology offered. Instead, there was an exchange of names, dates, and a sitting together over coffee that made the edges of old things less sharp. The harbor took in visitors who arrived by choice and by accident, and some left with a kind of surprised gratitude. A painter from a city stayed for a month and painted scenes of the pier that accentuated the stoops and the small boxes that sheltered tools. Their paintings were not for sale. Instead, they gave one to the museum, a depiction of a twilight where the water held a path of gold. It hung near the door so that people entering would see themselves reflected in the light of the artist's attention. The children, who grew into teenagers and then into young adults, continued to come back. Anna's bakery sold a loaf called the Keeper's Braid, and a small boy once bought one with his pocket money and refused to eat it until Raphael signed the wrapper. These small acts, signing the wrapper, posting a note, bringing a cup of tea when someone was ill, became the town's grammar of care. They were ordinary gestures that compounded into a network of steadiness. One morning in late autumn, a stranger arrived with a metal box and a cautious manner. He said he had been a diver who had looked for artifacts and had found the box tangled on an old anchor. Inside were letters bound with a rubber band and a sketchbook, whose pages fluttered like the memory of wind. The handwriting was cramped and patient, and the sketches were of places with names that felt like a map of absence. Mara catalogued the letters and read one aloud to the museum volunteers, a passage that spoke of being sorry for not writing sooner, and a wish to be visited again, if the sea allowed. Those letters taught the town that sometimes reaching out after a long silence could start a small reconciliation that did not require a spectacular event. They taught that apologies and acknowledgments are daily work, not grand finales. The letters were archived, and a digital scan was placed in a folder the school children could view on their visits, so that future generations might learn how to tend such fragile things. As they grew older, the three of them learned to savor small luxuries, morning light at a certain angle in the museum that made a tile sparkle, a loaf that rose with a particularly generous heart, a cup of tea steeped to the right strength. They sat together more often in the quiet hours, not always speaking but enjoying the proximity that years of shared work had made comfortable. Each of them had private rituals. Raphael warmed his palms against a tin mug before checking the ledger. Mara catalogued every small victory with a pencil tick. Joachim tested a new bread recipe 3 times before offering it to the public. There were evenings when the three friends sat at Joachim's table and read aloud from books that none of them had finished during school. They discovered authors who had made the sea a character, poems that sounded like ropes, and essays that argued eloquently for the slow art of attention. Anna sometimes joined, bringing a teacup and asking sharp Questions that made the older ones laugh at their own certainties. When a new generation of children arrived who had never known the sharp edge of the needle's anonymous posts, the town felt lighter in a way that was not a forgetting but a relief. It had been decades since that angry blog had become the main conversation, and people had become practiced at listening without immediate condemnation. They had learned to separate accusation from curiosity and to ask for evidence in a way that was not performative. In the slow arc of time, the harbor resisted complete erasure. New boats came, some modern and glittering, and others that smelled of tar and the honest sweat of their builders. The market evolved but kept its essential character: fishermen trading complaints and predictions, bakers swapping lopsided pastries, an old woman who sold knitted mittens that never quite matched. The museum changed staff as people retired and new volunteers came, and the small rituals of opening and closing were passed on as a liturgy. When at last Raphael felt the years pressing differently into his shoulders, he did not retire in a single day. He eased into a schedule that allowed more mornings for the pier and fewer nights on the ledger. He began to write down lessons for the future keepers in a small notebook, blunt and handwritten, such as, check for frayed fiber near the cleats, always ask a second person to help with heavy loads, listen when a sailor does not tell the whole story at once. These notes read like a sermon from a man who had learned to make daily duties a kind of devotion. Mara, whose hands never stopped moving, found new satisfaction in mentoring young conservators. She supervised projects remotely sometimes and wrote notes in a spidery hand for students who would later visit the museum. Joachim, for his part, opened a small apprenticeship scheme and taught his trainees how to respect the fermenting time of dough and the dignity of a finished loaf. He refused to sell the secret of a particular recipe but allowed apprentices to learn the timing by doing. When a kiosk selling modern souvenirs came to town and threatened to crowd out a craftsman who made wooden toys, the trio organized a small fair to showcase local makers. The fair celebrated the rhythm of hands at work and the quiet joy of owning an object made by someone whose fingers bore honest marks. The kiosks were modest. The festival was small. The village had a party where the music was old and the laughter was real. In the end, there was no sudden revelation or sweeping headline. The town moved forward the way a boat moves on many small, managed pulls at its oars. The community learned, slowly and imperfectly, that honesty and sustained attention do not always make news, but they do produce a sturdier life. The museum remained a place where the public could enter and be invited to hold a memory with care, a place where children learned the names of knots and the ethics of repair. On a final evening not marked by anniversary or event, three friends stood on the pier and watched the light spill over the bay in a burnished wash. No one spoke of endings. They were not brave for the sake of being brave, they were simply practiced at presence. A child ran by with a kite that lifted because the wind obliged, and the three of them laughed at the simplicity of such a sight. They closed the museum lights together and walked back toward the cafe where hands would be ready to cut bread for any late arrivals. The practice of tending did not need a moral to be useful. It was its own testimony. Visitors left and returned, storms came and abated, and the harbor held the stories of those who had learned, imperfectly but persistently, to repair and to remain. When you walk past their bench now, you might trace the faint letters and feel something like the comfort of a current at your feet. The harbor keeps working. The town keeps remembering. And the small acts of care keep being performed, one conscientious step at a time.